father and daughter went missing on a hike. 14 years later, only one came back. They were only supposed to be gone for a short hike. But that night, Danielle got a call. Her husband and daughter never checked in. Search teams found a pink bandana and a water bottle. No bodies. No footprints. And then, 14 years later, a girl walked into a ranger station barefoot and said her name was Naomi. Welcome to Minority Struggles. If this story hits home, subscribe and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, let's begin. Danielle Carter stood in the gravel parking lot of Shenandoah Ridge Trailhead, arms crossed tightly across her chest, watching her husband adjust the straps on their daughter's backpack. It was a bright spring morning, cool enough for a jacket, but warm enough to smell the green on the wind. Evan knelt beside Naomi, looping her arms through the chest strap, and clicked it into place. "You're all set," he said with a grin, ruffling her curls. Naomi grinned back and turned to her mom. "I packed the sketchbook like you said." She held up her little canvas bag. "And snacks." Danielle smiled, but the edge of worry stayed in her chest. "Good. Just make sure you both check in with the ranger station before dark, okay? Promise." Evan chuckled and kissed her on the forehead. "We're just doing the loop. 2 miles out, 2 back. Be home by dinner. You'll miss us by lunch." Danielle tried to laugh, but she didn't like it. She didn't like letting them walk off alone. But Evan loved the woods. He was steady, reliable, careful. He had his GPS watch, the trail map, a flare kit. He was an Eagle Scout for God's sake. And Naomi loved these weekend hikes. Her chance to escape the noise, scribble in her sketch pad, ask 1,000 questions about squirrels and leaves and clouds. Danielle stood by the car, arms crossed, as she watched them disappear into the trees. Evan turned once and waved. Naomi did too, with both arms. It was the last time she saw them. At first, everything seemed normal. Danielle ran errands, folded laundry, prepped dinner. By 5, she glanced at the clock and expected Evan's usual text. "Almost back." Nothing. By 6, she called. No signal. By 6:30, she was back in the car, speeding toward the trailhead. Evan's car was still there. Danielle called the ranger station in a panic. A man named Jenkins answered. "They haven't checked in?" he asked, confused. "They were supposed to be out hours ago." He told her to stay put and promised to send a patrol. She waited in the front seat, staring at the darkening forest. By 7:30, a ranger truck pulled into the lot. Jenkins stepped out, young and polite. "It's probably nothing. Maybe they took the wrong loop. Happens all the time." Danielle didn't believe him. By midnight, there were 5 more trucks, 2 dogs, and a helicopter overhead. Voices echoed through the trees. Naomi's name bounced off the rocks. The next morning, they found her pink bandana snagged on a branch near the East Ridge. A water bottle lay beside an old fire ring, half a mile off trail. Evan's initials were carved into the side, but no footprints, no signs of fall, no blood. Volunteers joined. News crews arrived. Danielle gave interviews in the parking lot, eyes wide and red. People brought casseroles and candles. Her neighbors held vigils. After 3 days, the official word was, "We're scaling back the search." After 6 days, it's now a recovery operation. After 10 days, presumed dead, Danielle refused to leave. She slept in the car at the trailhead. She walked the loops herself, called their names until her voice cracked. When she finally did return home, the apartment felt frozen in time. Naomi's school books sat open. Evan's hiking boots were by the door. The place still smelled like them. Then came the rumors. Why didn't she go with them? Did Evan take Naomi on purpose? Was there trouble at home? Why didn't the police find a body? One reporter even asked if she thought Evan had faked their deaths. Danielle stopped answering her phone. When the anniversary came, she stood alone at the base of the trail, holding a photo of Naomi in one hand and the GPS map printout in the other. The search had officially ended months ago, but she had never stopped. Somewhere, deep inside, she didn't feel grief the way people expected. Not yet, because nothing made sense. Evan was prepared. He never strayed from trail. Naomi was too small to wander alone. Something had happened, but no one could tell her what. Every year after that, she returned on the same day, stood in the same spot, whispered Naomi's name into the trees, and waited for an answer that never came. The world moved on. The story faded from headlines. The search logs were filed away. The trail reopened to the public. Hikers came and went. Naomi became a name on a faded bulletin board, then disappeared from that too. Danielle never stopped. She wrote letters to the Ranger Service, sent updates to missing persons groups, walked the old loop by herself. She knew every rock, every bend in the path. She memorized every tree. She listened for a voice that no one else believed could still exist. But she believed, because a mother knows when her child is gone. And more than that, when they're not. 14 years later, the early morning fog was still lifting over the Shenandoah Hills when Ranger Melissa Ortega arrived at the station on Route 58. She stepped out of her Jeep balancing a thermos, a clipboard, and the soft hum of routine. Her day was supposed to be easy: log trail reports, check a few radio updates, maybe help a couple of early hikers find their bearings. But before she even turned the key in the office door, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure stood near the edge of the parking lot. At first, Melissa thought it was a lost camper. Skinny frame, messy clothes, limbs hunched from the cold. But as the shape stepped closer, Melissa froze. It was a young woman, barefoot, dirty. Her pants were torn at the knees and caked in dried mud. Her oversized shirt hung loosely, neckline frayed. Her hair, matted, tangled, and sun-bleached, curled wildly around her face. She looked half-starved, her collarbones sharp, her skin scraped and sunburnt. She didn't speak, just stepped into the building slowly and collapsed against the counter near the coffee machine. Melissa dropped everything and rushed over. Hey, you all right? The girl didn't answer. Her lips barely moved, her eyes unfocused, blinking like the lights overhead were too bright. What's your name, sweetheart? Melissa asked softly. The girl's mouth opened slightly. A whisper, hoarse, almost inaudible, came out. Naomi. Melissa's heart skipped. She'd heard that name before. She didn't know where from exactly, but it struck a nerve like a long-forgotten chord. Something deep, something buried. She guided the girl to a chair, called emergency services, and pulled out the old missing persons binder, just to be sure. Page 32. There it was. Naomi Carter, 9 years old at the time of disappearance. Last seen on a hike with her father, Evan Carter. May 17, 2009. Danielle Carter's name was listed as the mother. Melissa remembered the news clips, the vigils, the rumors. That case had haunted this region for years. By the time the paramedics arrived, Naomi was unconscious, dehydrated, bruised, and dangerously underweight, but still alive. Melissa followed the ambulance all the way to Bluefield County Regional. At the hospital, doctors inserted IVs, ran vitals, and cleaned the wounds on her legs. She stirred only briefly, murmuring unintelligible things about fire, fish, and trees. The nurses tried to comfort her. One of them braided her hair loosely just to keep it from falling in her face. Melissa made the call to state police. They made the call to Danielle. Danielle Carter dropped her phone on the floor. It clattered against the tile, but she didn't hear it. Her mind was spinning. The dispatcher had said the name, but it didn't feel real. Naomi? Found? She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She just grabbed her coat, her keys, and sped out of the apartment with no shoes on. It took her less than 2 hours to reach the hospital, but it felt like she aged a decade on the drive. Every red light made her fists clench on the steering wheel. Every passing siren made her heart jump. When she pulled into the parking lot and stepped through the automatic doors, she felt like she was walking into a dream she'd had 1,000 times and never once dared to believe. The nurse guided her down the hallway, past the buzz of monitors and the soft sounds of nurses changing shifts. And then they stopped in front of a room. Danielle peered through the small glass window in the door. Inside, lying on a hospital bed, was a young woman. Gaunt, pale with hollow cheeks, but familiar. Danielle recognized her immediately. Her baby. It was in the arch of her nose, the curl in her brow, the slight scar over her left eye. Danielle remembered when Naomi fell off the porch swing and cried so hard, she hiccuped in her arms for hours. That scar had never faded. Danielle raised her hand to the glass and pressed her palm to it, trembling. Inside, Naomi stirred. She looked up, and their eyes met. No recognition. No flicker of awareness. Just blank, tired eyes. Danielle's heart broke all over again. A nurse opened the door and gestured for Danielle to come inside. She moved slowly, like her body wasn't sure how to exist in this moment. A detective stood quietly in the corner, taking notes. Danielle sat in the chair beside the bed. Naomi's eyes followed her, wary but not afraid. "Naomi," Danielle whispered. Her voice cracked. The girl blinked. Danielle leaned closer. "I'm your mom." A long pause. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "He said you were gone." Danielle's throat closed. "Who?" "Dad." Her voice was thin, almost childlike. "He said you left." Danielle's heart twisted. "No, baby. I never left. I never stopped looking." Naomi looked down at her hands. Her fingers twisted the edge of the blanket. "He said the world was broken, that we had to hide." Danielle reached out to take her hand. Naomi recoiled instinctively. Her entire body flinched. Danielle pulled back. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to. I'm just here." Over the next hour, the doctors returned with questions. The detectives asked gently about what she remembered. Naomi's answers came in fragments. She hadn't seen a phone or TV in years. She thought it was still 2019. She didn't know what town she was in. She remembered a lot of trees, a lot of silence, fire pits, fishing, someone, maybe Evan, teaching her how to build traps, telling her not to trust the outside world, teaching her to stay small, quiet, hidden. But it didn't sound like Evan. Not to Danielle. The man Naomi described, paranoid, controlling, strange, wasn't the man she married. Evan had been gentle, grounded, calm. He hadn't believed in hiding from the world. He believed in weekend hikes and trail mix and getting home before sundown. So what had happened out there? That answer came a few hours later, when a detective re-entered the room holding a folder. "We need to tell you something," he said carefully. "We pulled the dental records again, matched them with remains found in the national park back in 2013. They weren't identified at the time." Danielle's chest tightened. "It was Evan," he said. "He's been gone for over a decade." She didn't cry. She just stared at Naomi, her daughter, grown, alive, silent, and wondered if Evan had died 10 years ago, who had been raising her child in the woods all this time. And where was he now? Naomi stayed in the hospital for 5 days. Most of that time, she didn't speak unless someone asked her a direct question, and even then, her answers were clipped and measured. Doctors said it was a trauma response, selective mutism, dissociation, possible long-term survival conditioning. Danielle stayed close, never pushing, just sitting quietly in the chair beside her bed, knitting or reading, or just watching the rise and fall of her daughter's chest. It took 3 days before Naomi allowed Danielle to brush her hair. She barely ate the first 2 days. The nurses tried bringing bland food, then comfort food. It was a half-burnt grilled cheese that finally got her to finish a full plate. She ate like she wasn't sure if more would come. Danielle watched and said nothing. Naomi's body was slowly recovering, but her mind was a maze. She asked questions that made the doctors exchange glances. What year is it? Are the planes still flying? Do people still go to school? She wasn't being sarcastic. She was testing reality. The stories she had been told were unwinding in her mind, and she didn't know what was real anymore. Danielle started bringing in photo albums. Nothing too crowded, nothing too overwhelming. A picture of Naomi in a yellow jacket on her 5th birthday. A photo of Evan lifting her onto his shoulders at the county fair. A Christmas picture of all 3 of them, blurry, half laughing. Naomi looked at the photos without comment, but her hands hovered over the page like they wanted to touch the memory without getting burned. The detective assigned to the case, Sergeant Wynne, visited on the 4th day. He was calm, respectful, never rushed Naomi. He spoke to her like she was both fragile and intelligent. When he asked if she remembered where she'd been staying, she said she didn't know. Just trees. Always trees. And sometimes rocks that looked like stairs. She described the cave and the creek and a cabin with blue doors that smelled like firewood. Sergeant Wynne nodded and marked his notepad with silent urgency. Danielle sat in on the interviews. Every word Naomi said twisted her stomach. The man Naomi had called Dad wasn't Evan. She was sure of it now. Evan would have never taught her how to gut fish with a pocket knife. Evan never would have said her mother abandoned her. Evan didn't believe in hiding from the world, but Naomi kept calling him Dad. It was the only name she had for him. And then, on the 5th morning, Naomi said something that changed everything. I think he wasn't always the same. Danielle glanced up from her tea. What do you mean, sweetheart? Naomi hesitated. She was sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed, sketchbook open on her lap. She hadn't drawn anything yet, just made tiny circles in the corner of the page. He changed, Naomi said softly. His voice, his beard. I think it was someone else for a while. Danielle's chest clenched. Do you remember names? Anything he called himself? Naomi frowned. Martin maybe, or Marlin. He had different coats. One time he said his name was Jim when we stopped at a gas place. I don't think it was real. Sergeant Wynn came back in that afternoon and listened carefully. He asked Naomi if she would look at a lineup. No pressure, no rush. She nodded. It was digital on a tablet. 6 faces at a time. Naomi scrolled slowly, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't flinch until page 5. That one, she said quietly, tapping the screen. The man was in his late 50s. Graying beard, crooked smile, eyes that didn't match. His name was Martin Ellis. Danielle felt her body go cold. She remembered the name vaguely, something from a case that had floated through the news years ago. We confirmed it quietly. Martin Ellis was a known survivalist. Arrested once for child endangerment in Missouri in 2005. The charges were dropped after he fled the state. He'd gone underground, off-grid, a ghost. Naomi didn't cry. She just looked tired. Her hand rested on her lap, knuckles white from the grip. Sergeant Wynn excused himself. Danielle stood beside Naomi and gently touched her shoulder. You're doing so good, baby, she whispered. You're being so brave. Naomi turned toward her, face unreadable. Why didn't you come find me? Danielle's breath caught. I tried, she said. Every day, every year. I walked that trail every spring. I sent your picture everywhere. But they told me. She stopped herself. The words felt like excuses. Naomi stared at her for a long time. Then she looked away. He said you forgot me. Danielle sank slowly into the chair beside her. He lied. Naomi didn't answer. She just closed the sketchbook and lay back down. The next day, Sergeant Wynn returned with news. They had reopened the investigation. A task force was being assembled. They were searching through backlogged cabin registrations, forest surveillance records, and repair logs for isolated properties. Ranger Ortega was helping coordinate wilderness tracking. Naomi agreed to let them take a fresh witness statement. Danielle sat in the hallway while it happened. Her fingers trembled in her lap, picking at the corner of her coat sleeve. She wanted to run into the room and protect Naomi from every question, every memory. But she didn't. Naomi had made it 14 years. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. When the door opened, Naomi stepped into the hallway with tired eyes. She looked at Danielle, then leaned gently into her arms. Danielle froze, startled. Then she hugged her daughter tightly, burying her face in her shoulder, holding on like she could glue the years back together with her grip. She didn't let go for a long time. And for the first time since the phone rang that morning, Danielle let herself believe. Naomi was really home. Danielle woke before sunrise the next morning. The hospital had given her a spare cot in Naomi's room, though she rarely used it. Most nights, she dozed in the recliner with a blanket over her lap and one eye half open, always listening for the sound of Naomi shifting or speaking in her sleep. But tonight had been quiet. No nightmares. No whispers. Naomi was curled on her side, hugging a pillow, breathing softly. A peace Danielle hadn't seen in 14 years had settled over her face, even if it might only last until breakfast. By mid-morning, the detective and Ranger Ortega arrived. Ortega had stayed in close contact since the beginning, and Naomi seemed more at ease with her than anyone else in a uniform. Ortega brought a stack of laminated maps and a printout of incident logs from the last 10 years. Danielle moved to the corner of the room while they spread everything out on the table. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, legs dangling. She looked at the maps for a long time, silent. These are all known shelter areas within 50 miles of where you were found, Ortega explained. Some of these are just old ranger cabins. Others are old homesteads that haven't been maintained. Some have had reports filed. Trespassing, broken windows, people camping illegally. Anything look familiar? Naomi hesitated, then pointed to one in the northeast quadrant. That one. He called it the Blue Cabin. It smelled like old trees. Danielle stepped forward. That's the one you mentioned before. He took you there often? Naomi nodded. Only in the winter. There were others. A cave near a rock shaped like a chair. A tunnel under a hill. I don't know how to explain it. Ortega listened carefully, jotting notes while Sergeant Wynn cross-referenced Naomi's memories with known incidents. Something was forming. A pattern of movements, behavior, and locations. He never let me see maps, Naomi said quietly. But he'd point at trees. Landmarks. And we'd move when he said we had to. Sometimes every week. Sometimes not for months. Did he ever leave you alone? Ortega asked. Naomi shook her head. Not until the end. Not until he left to get supplies and never came back. Danielle's hands clenched behind her back. She heard Naomi say those words already. But every time she said them again, it stung deeper. When the team left that day, Naomi was quieter than usual. Danielle sat next to her, waiting, not pushing. Finally, Naomi asked, "Why do people think he was my dad?" Danielle took a deep breath. Because he let them. But I remember Dad's face, Naomi said. He wasn't that man. Not at all. No, baby, Danielle said softly. That wasn't your father. Naomi looked out the window. So what happened to him? Danielle hesitated. Then she said the words. They found your dad's remains 10 years ago. He died not long after that hike. Naomi didn't flinch. She just stared at the trees in the distance. I think I knew, she said. He was there at the beginning. I remember the sound of him shouting. Then nothing. Danielle moved beside her on the bed and wrapped an arm around her. Naomi didn't resist. Later that evening, Sergeant Wynn returned with an update. He held a manila folder and a look Danielle recognized. One that meant bad news, or worse, news that complicated everything. We ran a deeper check on Martin Ellis, he said. There's more. He laid out documents on the table. Old arrest records, photographs, scanned transcript from Missouri. In 2005, Ellis had been investigated for suspected child endangerment. He was living with a girl he claimed was his niece. Her name was never confirmed. Neighbors reported strange behavior. She was pulled from school. When social services came, he vanished. He's a drifter, Wynn said. Off-grid. Multiple aliases. All low-tech. He's good at disappearing. Naomi stood across the room, arms folded, face blank. She didn't say a word. He taught me how to be invisible, she said finally. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. The investigation gained national traction within days. Naomi's story spread across the country. Found girl may hold key to survivalist suspect. People speculated. Podcasts rehashed theories. Reporters waited outside the hospital until security forced them off the property. Danielle turned off the television. She didn't need commentary. She just wanted her daughter to get a full night of sleep. But then came the break. A woman in Georgia recognized the face from the photo the sheriff's department released. She said a man named Jim Martin had worked at her brother's scrapyard for the past 2 years, paid cash, kept himself, lived in a rundown trailer just outside Macon. Within hours, a multi-agency team was en route. The trailer was empty, but what they found inside made everyone sick. There were sketches, Naomi's old drawings, her sketchbook from years ago, covered in leaves but still intact, a spiral notebook filled with lists, dates, ages, locations. Some were girls, some were marked with an X, and then, taped to the wall, were faded missing posters. Not just of Naomi, of others. Danielle stood in the conference room at the sheriff's office staring at the photos. She felt like the ground was falling away beneath her feet. He wasn't just hiding her, she whispered. He was looking for others. Naomi came into the room slowly, eyes scanning the walls. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at the sketchbook. And she said, I thought he burned it. A few days later, the U.S. Marshals issued a nationwide bolo, be on the lookout, for Martin Ellis, wanted for child abduction, exploitation, and suspected serial targeting of minors. His face was everywhere. Every airport, every bus station, every small-town diner. But for Naomi, the noise didn't matter. She began sleeping with her door unlocked. She let Danielle sit beside her as she sketched again. And when Danielle brought her a new journal, Naomi wrote her name on the first page. Naomi Carter. Not Nay. Not M. Not any of the nicknames he used to keep her small. Her name. Her full name. And with that small act, she started taking herself back. The media wouldn't let it go. Once the photo of Martin Ellis circulated nationally, Naomi's face went with it. It was supposed to be about justice. About catching the man who'd taken her childhood. But Danielle quickly realized the world wasn't only watching for justice. It was watching for entertainment. Talk shows dissected Naomi's posture. Headlines speculated about Stockholm Syndrome. Armchair psychologists argued online about what she must have felt for the man who raised her. Danielle turned off the news. She blocked calls from reporters. But they still found ways. Mail, emails, strangers showing up at the hospital pretending to be volunteers. Naomi saw her photo trending on Twitter. The girl who lived in the woods. One post had over 2 million likes. Underneath it, someone commented, "Bet she doesn't even remember how to use a microwave." She laughed when she read that. A brittle, exhausted sound. Then she set the phone down and didn't touch it again for 2 days. The only interview Naomi agreed to was with a local black-owned station. One she and Danielle watched quietly over dinner. She said yes only because Ranger Ortega told her the journalist, Maya Bell, had been covering missing persons cases in the region for nearly a decade, including hers. The interview was recorded in a small studio. No lights in her face. No big cameras. Just Maya, Naomi, and Danielle sitting off-screen. "What do you want to say to Martin Ellis?" Maya asked gently. Naomi hesitated. Her hands were folded in her lap. "I don't," she said after a long silence. "I've said enough." Maya nodded. "Then what do you want to say to the people watching?" Naomi looked into the lens, not defiant, not afraid. Just clear. "I miss my life," she said. "I miss being 9. I missed everything. Birthdays. School. Pizza. Thunderstorms. And now, everyone keeps asking how I feel. But nobody asked how I survived." She paused. Her voice stayed even. "I survived because I remember my mom's voice. Not her face. Not what she looked like. Just her voice. That's what got me through the woods. Through the lies. That's what told me, keep walking." Danielle cried quietly in the corner, her fist pressed to her mouth. The clip aired that night. It went viral. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. For the first time, the story became less about what had been done to Naomi and more about what she'd done to reclaim herself. Still, no one had found Ellis. Danielle hated that. The idea of him out there, watching the same stories, reading the same headlines, seeing Naomi's face, and smiling in the dark. Naomi didn't talk about him much anymore. But she didn't sleep through the night either. Some mornings, Danielle found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the door like she expected it to swing open. So a detective went asked if Naomi was willing to help build a more detailed psychological profile, details that could narrow down Ellis's patterns, habits, hideouts. Danielle thought she'd say no. But Naomi nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's end it." She sat with forensic analysts. She described the trail markers Ellis used, the way he stored food, the supplies he liked. She remembered the books he read, old wilderness guides from the 70s. She sketched floor plans of cabins they stayed in, mapped distances, recalled how long they'd spend walking between hideouts. Every detail helped. Every memory took something out of her. But she kept going. One night, after a long debriefing, she and Danielle sat in the kitchen eating leftover spaghetti. Naomi looked up from her plate and said, "I think I want to testify. If they find him." Danielle stopped chewing. "You don't have to. You've already." "I want to," Naomi said, "because I don't want the last thing he remembers about me to be that I was scared." The next morning, the FBI raided a storage facility in rural Arizona. A clerk had recognized Ellis from a wanted poster and tipped off local police. Inside the unit, they found evidence, camping gear, trail journals, and a phone with saved voice memos. Most were recordings of Ellis himself. Rambles, paranoia, obsessions. But one was a recording of Naomi, much younger, reciting a story about a deer and a girl lost in the woods. Danielle had to leave the room when they played it. 2 days later, Ellis was arrested at a rest stop just outside Flagstaff. He was alone, disguised, living under a stolen identity. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared at the agents blankly and said, "She was better off with me." The news broke during dinner. Naomi watched the screen quietly, her fork resting on the edge of her plate. "He always said if the world found us, it'd kill us," she murmured. Guess he was wrong. Danielle reached across the table and took her hand. Naomi didn't let go. That weekend, Naomi testified via recorded statement. She described what he did, not in gruesome detail, but with clarity. The false names, the lies, the fear, the isolation. She described the years without birthdays, without mirrors, without safety. She ended the statement with one line: "He didn't raise me. He buried me. I just happened to crawl out." The courtroom was silent. Ellis was sentenced to life without parole. Naomi wasn't there in person, but she watched from home. When the judge read the ruling, she let out a long breath and leaned against Danielle's shoulder. Danielle whispered, "It's over." But Naomi shook her head. "No, it's just starting." That night, she asked if they could visit a local park. Not the woods, just open space. Danielle agreed. They walked along a paved trail. Naomi kept stopping to look at flowers, benches, even trash bins. "I forgot how many things you don't see in the forest," she said. Danielle nodded. "There's more to see now." And Naomi smiled. A full, open, quiet smile. Not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time in 14 years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. 6 months later, the cuffs finally closed around his wrists. Martin Ellis had been hiding in plain sight, using the name James Howell, living out of a converted van registered to a stolen ID, drifting between rest stops and trailheads in northern Arizona. It was a gas station clerk who recognized his face from the wanted poster. She didn't say anything to him. She just called it in as soon as he pulled away. When the marshals found him at a rest stop off Interstate 17, he was sitting at a picnic table, sipping black coffee from a thermos, like it was any other day. He didn't resist. He didn't deny who he was. He just looked at the officers with dull eyes and said, "She was better off with me." When Danielle heard the news, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat at the kitchen table, phone still in her hand, and whispered, "Thank you." Naomi was in the next room. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked up from her sketchbook and waited. "He's been arrested," Danielle said softly. "He's going to trial." Naomi blinked slowly. "Well, I have to go." "No," Danielle said. "Not unless you want to." Naomi looked down at her drawing. "I think I do." The courtroom was packed. Media vans lined the street outside. Protesters, supporters, reporters, all gathered for what had become the case of the year. The story of Naomi Carter had moved beyond the local news cycle. Now, it was a symbol of survival, of justice delayed, of a broken system, and the girl who somehow walked out of the forest whole enough to speak. Naomi didn't sit in the witness stand directly. She gave her testimony behind a screen, her identity protected by law. But her voice was steady, clear, and calm. She recounted how Martin took her when she was 9, how he lied and told her the world had ended, how he moved her from shelter to shelter, feeding her stories about danger and betrayal and convincing her that Danielle had abandoned her. "He never hit me," she said at one point. "But he didn't have to. He erased me." Danielle sat in the front row, gripping a tissue in both hands, not blinking. Martin's defense attorney tried to paint him as mentally ill, a delusional man who thought he was protecting the child from a dangerous world. The courtroom didn't buy it, especially not after they played the recordings. In his storage unit, the FBI had found hours of audio. Martin talking to himself, narrating what he'd done. In one, he said plainly the dad died quick. Slipped. Skull cracked like a melon. The girl was crying, but she listened real good after a few days. That line alone was enough to ensure the sentence. Life without parole. The judge didn't offer a long speech. She just read the verdict and let the silence settle. Outside, reporters crowded for a statement. Danielle declined. Naomi stayed inside. They didn't need to say anything. Justice for once spoke for itself. But justice wasn't the same as peace. Naomi still woke up some nights in a sweat. Still flinched at sudden noises. still avoided mirrors for reasons even she couldn't explain. But she was healing. Slowly, she and Danielle moved to a quiet town near Charlottesville, not far from the Blue Ridge Trails, but far enough to feel new. Naomi started seeing a therapist. She took long walks in the park. She cooked again. Small things. Ordinary things. One day, she asked Danielle if they could visit a wilderness program that helped survivors of trauma reconnect with nature safely. Danielle agreed without hesitation. Naomi ended up volunteering there. She taught little kids how to build safe shelters, how to track trail markers, how to draw what they saw instead of what they feared. Danielle watched from a distance, always close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Naomi didn't stumble. She started using her full name again. She re-enrolled for her GED. She even posted her art online under her real identity for the first time. Then, one evening in late spring, Naomi asked Danielle if they could take a short walk on a nearby trail. Just the two of them. Danielle packed 2 sandwiches, 2 bottles of water, and a sweater for each of them, just in case. The trail was only a mile. Flat. Safe. They walked in silence at first. Birds chirped overhead. Sunlight filtered through the trees in soft beams. Naomi paused to pick up a leaf and turned it over in her hand like she was seeing it for the first time. At a small clearing, they sat on a bench. Naomi pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to the middle. She drew quickly, her hands steady, her lines sure. When she was done, she turned the page toward Danielle. It was a simple drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands. One had curly hair. Naomi uncapped her pen and wrote beneath it in neat, small letters. Me and Mom. Danielle didn't speak. She just pulled her daughter into a hug and let the tears fall freely. Not from grief, but from something bigger. Relief. Restoration. Naomi leaned into her shoulder and whispered, I wasn't ready before. Danielle nodded, her voice gone. But I am now. They sat like that for a long time, mother and daughter, beneath the trees that had once separated them. And this time, they didn't feel lost.